This evening is the 8th and final lecture in the 1964 Fall Faculty Lecture Series. As such, it provides an opportunity to thank the lecturers who have participated in the series publicly, and to thank those of you who followed the series, especially those of you who are, hardcore followers of the entire series. It's also an opportunity to make a couple of announcements. We thought that some of you might be interested in the lecture which will follow this Friday evening, a lecture which is, not technically part of this series. At the moment on the campus is a visiting professor, Gerald Moore, from Uganda, who will speak this Friday evening in the hall which is immediately to your right, adjacent to this one. Professor Moore is something of an expert on African literature and poetry, and will give a lecture at 8 p.m. this Friday, that's December 4th, I believe, on the topic Modern African Poetry. You're invited to this should any of you care to attend. Then I'd also like to tell you that the spring faculty lecture series is now formulated. The publicity on that will be out shortly. I thought you might like to know something of the series, what it will be. It's a series that's been put together by Professor Libby, who is director of the UCLA Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics. And it's a series which will present 6 of the distinguished scientists of this campus in a series of Monday evening lectures, beginning on March 1st in this hall. I might read to you the titles of those lectures. The first is Space Science and the World Today, then the History of the Earth, and a lecture on earthquakes, one on gravity in the Earth, the Moon, diamonds and their origin, and the final one called Mountain Building. This evening's lecturer is Howard Wilson. Professor Wilson is Dean of the UCLA School of Education, has been so since 1957. He holds an MA from the University of Chicago, Doctor of Education from Harvard University, and also is a recipient of an honorary Doctor of Laws from Illinois College. Among his many past activities, I might mention the fact that he was the first editor of the Harvard Educational Review, president of the National Council for Social Studies, member of the American Council on Education, consultant to the Department of State, organized the Canada-United States Committee on Education, director of the educational program of the Carnegie Endowment. This goes on and on. Holds the high distinction of being a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations. I might mention from his numerous publications of the books that he has authored or co-authored, a few that are pertinent to this evening, which would include a book which is called the United States National Commission for UNESCO, another called Universities and World Affairs, College Life as Education in World Outlook, and one that's very recent, 1963, a book which is called American Higher Education and World Affairs. The committee is indeed honored to have Dean Wilson with us this evening. The topic of his lecture is the educational explosion in Africa. It's indeed a great honor to present Dean Howard Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very deeply conscious of the privilege of giving this lecture and of your courtesy in coming to hear it. I'll do my best to discuss as well as I can some of the enormous educational travail now occurring in the emerging nations south of the Sahara. Actually, I ought to feel quite apologetic for being here. As you can tell from my voice, I've recently been in the colder climates of the Middle West, and now I'm a confirmed Californian, but a little too late. I hope this voice isn't too much of a harassment for your ears. More important, my colleague, Professor Wendell Jones, is really UCLA's specialist on African education, and in many ways he should be speaking tonight on my topic. But he is in Africa enjoying the field research that seems so entrancing to all Africanists, and as a result, I'm here. In treating the topic, the education explosion in Africa, you may have to conclude that I know more about the explosive than about the purely African aspects of my subject. If so, put that down to the fact that I spend most of my time in a dean's office, and such an office is ordinarily more prone to explosions than it is to sustained African studies. The background against which I speak is that of a student of comparative education, that is, of education in its international framework. Such a background emphasizes, for me at least, that in current decades, we are on the threshold of a universal turmoil and ferment, a universal period of controversy and creativity in education, for which the term explosion, even though it's hackneyed, is really too mild. Many of the social and economic and political trends which are distinctive in contemporary society in these years come to a functional focus on education. They gain cumulative force by this convergence on the educational field, and because of them, education now operates in a new period of testing and turmoil, one which tests the vitality and the validity of old educational theories and practices, and which opens new educational horizons, exactly as it opens new horizons for society itself, and certainly for all new nations. During the remaining years of the 20th century, there is certain to be, in my opinion, an education explosion of unprecedented magnitude and on a worldwide scale. It is for mankind an inconceivably expanded version of H.G. Wells' old remark concerning civilization as a race between education and catastrophe. The education upheaval is a fact for all nations of the world, and for Africa, a reality of the first magnitude. I propose this evening to indicate 5 basic social trends which give education this explosive character all over the world, and to indicate how each of these trends has some special force or facet in Africa itself. Then I shall venture in conclusion to make some comments and raise some questions about specific aspects of African education, raising the questions not because the answers to them are at hand, but because they may indicate some of the educational stumbling blocks that make the path of the emerging African nations more difficult than we or they sometimes assume. The first social trend which affects the future through the present, and therefore challenges education, is demographic in character. The growth in the world's population within the present century is phenomenal, and the rate of that increase projected into coming decades almost overwhelming. No appraisal of education anywhere can ignore this fact. About 1,650,000,000 people lived on Earth at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, the number has reached something like 3,150,000,000. For the year 2000, the number is estimated at 6 billion persons. A growth rate of this character means, to an educator at least, that the world is producing prospective pupils at a rate far greater than it is even thinking of building classrooms or training teachers or printing textbooks, even in the older and more economically favored countries. Each year, armies of children march, or maybe I should say crawl, onto the stage of contemporary life, and are then pushed forward relentlessly by even larger armies of the newly born. A population explosion lies at the heart of the universal explosion in education. The general proportions of population statistics of the world as a whole apply to the situation in Africa. While reliable population figures on Africa are hard to come by and are particularly lacking in historical perspective because of the lack of census reports until recent decades, certain illustrative data can be pointed out. Some 285 million people were estimated in 1960 to be living in the whole of the African continent. About 175 million were living in the area which concerns us this evening, that lying between the two barren regions, the Sahara, barren with sand, and the Union of South Africa, barren with apartheid. Unfortunately, these estimates of 175 million in tropical area Africa are hardly more than educated guesses. Census operations in Africa are often impeded by the fear that the census taker is also the tax collector, and he may be, or by lack of technical know-how in census making, or by difficulties in terrain which hide whole villages from view, or by the numerical uncertainties that reside in a polygamous family situation. During the last census in Nigeria, for example, one cluster of villages was discovered in the bayous of the coast where 25,000 persons lived who had not been included in any preceding population surveys or estimates. In the same census, the population of the northern region in Nigeria far exceeded all estimates, perhaps because the Muslim families had not been counted in individual members, but on an assumed and erroneous family pattern in earlier surveys. But with all these uncertainties, it is clear that the population of tropical Africa is large and is rapidly growing. The birth rate is not less than the world average, and it is not less than the world average, particularly in areas where there are multiple marriages. The demographic factor is at least as potent in the African education explosion as it is for the rest of the world. It is likely that the area we are dealing with will have doubled its population to a total of somewhere between 350 and 400 million people by the year 2000. And even in planning for 1970 or 1980, the increase in the number of children to be educated in Africa is hardly less than staggering. Now, one or two other features of the population pressure on schools in Africa should be noted. All educational institutions have to be conducted and supported by the older population, that is, the population of working and income-producing age. In the United States, about 2/5 of our total population is under 20 years of age. That is, 2/5 are within the age range of what a modern, industrial, technical nation, such as the African nations want to be, would call the years of education. We regard this, in the United States, as a particularly difficult situation, in which we have so many young, as contrasted with a smaller proportion than we used to have in the productive age range of 20 to 65. This is because the low birth rate of the Depression 30s was followed by the very high birth rate of the war and post-war years in the United States. One of our major educational problems has been and is this population bulge of the young in current decades, but it will pass within another 15 years or so. In Tanganyika, on the other hand, somewhat more than half of the population is regularly less than 20 years old. And Tanganyika is probably fairly representative of tropical Africa in this respect. The population distribution on an age scale is such that Africa not only has very many children to educate, but a smaller proportion of the total population to man and pay for schools and other educative installations. Distribution of population not on an age scale, but in terms of urban-rural groupings, also has significance to education.
The history of education in the United States shows, especially as this country became industrialized, a strong trend away from the country, one-room district schoolhouse, and toward consolidated schools of one sort or another. Consolidation is based upon improved highways and rapidity of transport, among other matters. As these prerequisites are achieved, consolidated and enlarged schools are able to have better teachers, better libraries, better laboratories, and better programs at a reduced cost per pupil. We could not in the United States today educate young people for participation in our industrial technological kind of society through the old district school system, no matter how nostalgic some of us may feel about the little red schoolhouse. Neither can the new nations of Africa. For 30 years, to jump again to another part of the world, for 30 years after the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, 35 years ago, relatively little educational advance was made in Turkey because the government was absorbed with the slogan of a school in every village. Large numbers of the villages were actually too small to support a school or to warrant a school. Yet school buildings were erected in poverty-stricken Turkey for as few as 7 to 10 pupils. It might well have moved education and the country Turkey more rapidly forward had roads uniting the villages been built first, and only then schools of a consolidated, unified, economically viable character been built. Now, the geographical distribution of the population in Africa, then, has heavy significance for the educational programs that can be successful there. It seems to me that, in most of the countries we are dealing with, there is a tendency to concentrate on one-room rural schools as preparation of the manpower needed for the further development of the country. Or perhaps I should phrase it more accurately by saying that, as I see it, Africa is not giving enough attention to the educational potentials which inhere in its concentrations of population. The cities of Africa are growing much more rapidly than the rural areas, but hardly an African city has a well-organized, well-developed, thriving, consolidated, coordinated urban educational system with which to realize the full manpower potential which lies within the urban community. From limited observation, I have the feeling, too, that in some areas of Africa, ordinarily regarded as rural, the population densities are more nearly approximate urban conditions. In the territory around the trading center of Onitsha in western Nigeria, I understand there is a large, closely packed network of villages intimately related to one another by paths and roads. Here may actually lie a great city, though considerably concealed by the dense jungle growth of the area, certainly not a city visible from the air as Los Angeles is. The population density in certain of the highland areas of Kenya is also very high. Visiting a school there last spring, I was told of an African family getting its plot of ground no less than 7 miles from the nearest natural source of water. All the nearer plots, and the plots were small, being already occupied. It is not sensible to make plans for rural education in such areas as these. An urban approach to educational development is, I suspect, more needed and more feasible and potentially more productive than has yet been realized in any of these newly established African nations. The future of Tanganyika, for example, is fairly intimately related to what happens educationally in Dar es Salaam, and that of Nigeria hinges primarily on what happens in Lagos and Kano and Port Harcourt. The city concentrations of population, increased regularly by a steady flow from the rural areas, are the critical points in the African education explosion. But to return to the main point, the population pressures, including a high birth rate with slowly declining infant mortality, an age grouping in which the educable young frequently outnumber their elders, and a geographical distribution which makes urban concentrations of rising importance, even where rural concepts of education often prevail, lie at the heart of the education explosion in Africa. The children of Africa are pushing forward in explosive numbers, and the attempt to provide them an education reasonably adequate to the world they are entering is a task of staggering proportions. Sheer numbers do not indicate the full pressure coming from Africa's children and young people. Much has been written in recent years about a revolution in rising expectations. The force of aspirations, new hopes and ambitions stirs the youth of Africa, stirs all of Africa, today as not before in history. The rising expectations are a vital part of the education explosion. The wide prevalence of a mood of rising expectations among all peoples is too obvious to need much argument or illustration. We in affluent America have embraced the spirit of the mood for a long, long time. It is commonplace for us to assume that each year there will be advances in medicine and in the health services which make these advances available to us individually. We assume that there will be new schools for our children, better pavements on which to drive our better cars, a reasonably steady advance in television, and that there will be something new around every scientific corner, new and for us individually, whether good or bad. There is a confidence and a commonplace quality in our expectations which makes it difficult to realize the explosive force of the coming of expectations, expectations of improvement, to those who have not before possessed or perhaps been possessed by such expectations. The great numbers of African young and their parents are now aware of possibilities for the attainment of good health, which is, after all, the first of all liberties. They can envisage agricultural improvement and industrial development. They can begin to see their own books, their own newspapers, their own television shows. They are on the march toward things their forebears never before thought to possess. They expect, and with that expectation comes an urgency for education. It is because it is on education that the brunt of these expectations fall. Learning to read and write, learning the things that are taught or that they think are taught in the schools and universities of the older metropolitan centers, including the United States along with those of Europe, and learning them in a hurry, become the driving ambitions of untold numbers of African young. During the last decade, the elementary school population of tropical Africa has more than doubled. The number of students enrolled at all levels of schooling in French Africa, for example, increased almost fourfold, increased from 207,000 to 905,000, 270 to 905, during the years between 1946 and 1957. This means both that more children are entering school and that more are staying longer through the elementary grades. The first conference of African ministers of education, which met in Addis Ababa in 1961 under the auspices of UNESCO, estimated that the African states there represented had 11 million children in elementary school in 1961 and would have 33 million by 1980. That they had 816,000 secondary school pupils in 1961 and would have 6 million by 1980. That they had 25,000 university students in 1961, almost the number we have on this campus, and would have 328,000 in 1980. In 2 decades, they foresaw a 300% increase in elementary school enrollments, a 700% increase in secondary school enrollments, and a 1,300% increase in university registrations. Projected over 20 years, these increased numbers are breathtaking, and even the target figures year by year are impressive. And these target figures are based upon the expectations of national leaders as to what educational facilities could be provided. Back of them are the much vaster aspirations of all sections of the population. To give one illustration, the UCLA School of Education, under contract with the United States Agency for International Development and the government of Eastern Nigeria, of the Eastern region in Nigeria, is attempting to develop a comprehensive secondary school in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. Started 4 years ago, the school, which at present has a technical bias, admits 90 boys each year. This year, 4 years after the school was opened, there were 7,000 applicants for those 90 places. The Eastern region is now asking for an enlargement of the school to more than 4 times the capacity planned for it only 4 years ago. Every African government, urged on by demands of its increasing and aspiring people, which cannot be ignored, these aspirations, either in humane or political terms, every government is struggling frantically to provide the opportunity for an education on which the rising revolution in expectations comes to a demanding and insistent focus. A third factor in the education explosion, having universal impact, is the scientific technological revolution through which society is now passing. One has only to consider what has happened to American education since the first Sputnik went into outer space to realize the kind of impact scientific developments are having on contemporary thought and on education. The sobering fact is that science as a field and as a method has moved directly into the center of liberal education and also into the center of vocational and professional training. We hear much of these days of a new mathematics curriculum in the schools, which is paced by new curricula in the biological and physical sciences. All aspects of vocational education are being reoriented to the impact of technology on the economic life of 20th century nations. Developments along these lines are part of the education explosion everywhere, and they have particular significance for many of the newly created nations of Africa. Many of the expectations and aspirations mentioned earlier, both for individuals and for nations, are rooted in the desire to move rapidly toward an industrial technological society. Every new country has its 5-year or 10-year plan for economic development, and education is seen as a major instrument for this development. A new socio-economic order is envisaged by the creators of new states, and the schools are expected to help build the new order. Conceptions along these lines are usually calculated in terms almost exclusively of manpower needs. The schools and universities then become agencies for creating the manpower requisite for the new societies. This places upon educational institutions heavy responsibilities, along with a good many limitations and some distortions from an overall point of view toward education. All the frustrations, as well as all the visions of the economic planners, become reflected in the schools. But because education is there regarded as an instrument for building in Africa a new economic order of a scientific, industrial, technological character, the education explosion is itself compounded. 2 implications of this fact should be briefly noted. The first is the subtle and elusive interrelationship between the technical education needed for an industrializing economy and the general or liberal education needed for citizenship and for leadership in the new political units which embrace and nourish that changing economy. In most European nations, the paths of technical and liberal education have been traditionally quite separate. One of the more fortunate aspects of American education, perhaps accidentally arrived at, has been a reasonable integration or combination of technical and liberal education, or to put it in academic terms, about an equal emphasis on both distribution and concentration of studies through the high school and college years. African education is derived largely from European models, and the American pattern, which I think might be more useful to most African states in the long run, this aspect of the American pattern, is difficult to follow in the hurried struggles of nation building and of economic change. At the same time, one of the greatest challenges in African education today is to discover its own equivalent of the combination of scientific and humane studies which the United States has sought through its comprehensive high schools and its liberal arts colleges. This question, this search, lie close to the heart of the African difficulties today in secondary and higher education. Another factor in the impact of scientific technology on education lies in the technological frontiers of education itself. In recent decades, the motion picture, radio, television, teaching machines, and programmed instruction through these various media have added to education's kit of tools items quite as significant as the printed page itself. Here in the United States, current developments in education by radio and television, in closed circuit television, such as we're now beginning on the UCLA campus, in the teaching machines, which UCLA professors have helped develop, in the computation devices which affect enrollment procedures, the record keeping of the university, and the research possibilities of all our doctoral students, we are increasingly aware of the technological influences making for a revolution in educational and academic procedures. Africa, in the early stages of its educational development, has an opportunity to operate on this educational technical frontier, an opportunity which is also an intricate problem. If we today were to have a clean slate on which to create the ideal education for youth in the megalopolis of Los Angeles, to what extent would we really use schools? To what extent would we depend on television? To what extent films? To what extent museums and libraries and other institutions not yet realized? To what extent and in what ways would we combine and coordinate these educational instruments and institutions to secure a better educational result than we are now getting? The question needs to be asked not only for Los Angeles, but also for Addis Ababa and Nairobi and Lagos and all of Africa. In some ways, we may be the prisoners of past successes in perpetuating educational procedures and institutions which are already outmoded by this technological revolution. Africa has this opportunity. There is much talk of these matters among African educational leaders and in the bilateral and multilateral educational agencies which work in Africa. But there's more talk than actual achievement, I fear. As I shall indicate later, African educationists are often more conservative and Europeanly traditional in their educational concepts and their planning than are the more forward-looking and psychologically more secure educational planners of today's Europe and America. There is too much danger that the scientific technological revolution, which is remaking the economies of many sections of Africa, will not be adequately utilized in the continent's educational development. Closely related to the scientific technological revolution, which has its own great impact on educational directions and procedures, is a general explosion in knowledge during this century. This increase in what is known about both man and nature is a fourth element in the education explosion. Consider the additions to the university curriculum which have been made in the United States since 1900. Not only 6.5 decades, strenuous decades, adding to the cumulative record of history and literature and the arts, but various newly created social sciences and a multiplication and enormous development of the natural sciences. So extensive and influential is the current emphasis on research that in every field of knowledge, one can become outdated much more quickly today than was ever possible before. It's estimated that a scientist can now become functionally obsolete as a person, as a scientist, within a decade. For the makers of African schools and colleges, curriculum building, that is, the selection of what is most worth teaching in the time available from the vast accumulation of human knowledge, is extraordinarily complex. The new bodies of knowledge which are thrust into our ken every modern year not only cause the confusion of displacing some older knowledge and of facing us anew in our crowded schedules and curricula with the question of what knowledge is most worth learning. The increasing rate of knowledge accumulation calls for laboratories, technological library aids, and means of rapid computation and communication and information retrieval on an unprecedented scale. These add to the expense of modern educational installations. They are difficult to maintain, particularly where loyalty to learning is commensurate with the traditional forms of loyalty to books alone. The new centers of education in Africa have an opportunity to move directly into a technological stage so far as the computation, storage, and retrieval of data are concerned. But it is not yet clear that they will be financially able to do so, or that they are sufficiently free from 19th century traditions to do so. The explosion of knowledge is at least as difficult to cope with in Africa as in America, and perhaps even more difficult. The nations of today's Africa, in addition, are adding to knowledge by rediscovering and codifying their own past. African studies are a part of the concern of every African educational institution, both the universities and the schools. But this means a rewriting of history textbooks or writing of new history textbooks. And it also means the production of new texts related to African flora and fauna, to African geography, to African traditions. It means the creation of museums of indigenous art. It means the preservation of folklore and the preservation or recultivation of traditional handicrafts. Yet all this has to be done within a framework of preparing for change. The school has to be both an innovator and a recreator and preserver of the past if it is to fulfill the expectations of most of the African states. And I'm not sure that schools can serve this double function. Again, an illustration may make the point clear. In the school I mentioned a while ago, which UCLA is helping to develop at Port Harcourt, the curriculum is essentially geared to the manpower needs of the rapidly developing industries and commerce of the Port Harcourt area. The boys in the school spend much of each school day in laboratories and workshops. I think they should also be in studios in which they have the opportunity to learn and develop skill in some of the arts and crafts traditional in the Port Harcourt area. A few Nigerian schoolboys and schoolmasters are concerned about this, but most are not. They focus attention almost exclusively on the needs of the new industries and on preparation for jobs in them. We have not been able to secure funds or personnel for the Port Harcourt School with which to include studio activity in carving or in ceramics, though both crafts have flourished traditionally in the villages of that area. About the only tradition the school has been able to cultivate, and this on an extracurricular basis, of course, is drumming. A few boys bring their drums from their village homes. A California teacher has molded them into a drum corps, which has won most of the drumming prizes in the eastern region. This is popular both with the boys and with the general citizenry, but it is only a symbol of the real need, that of finding some way in which a rediscovered past can be educationally combined with preparation for a new way of industrial living. It may also be pointed out that African education, in its borrowing from the supposedly more advanced countries, sometimes confuses the symbols and the realities of that knowledge. Like most of the rest of us, they may take a traditional path of learning, which is not the shortest way to functional economic development. I have, for example, an African student here at UCLA, one of the ablest students I have, who was guided into majoring in Latin at his African university as preparation for graduate study here in the social sciences. More African boys have studied the history of the British Constitution or the great literature produced in France as preparation for careers in African business or politics than can probably be justified in objective terms. I do not for a moment intend to disparage any of these fields of learning. They are worthy in themselves and appropriate for many purposes. But too frequently in African institutions, the traditionally prestigious subjects of 19th century Europe and America still are assumed to be the surest paths towards success in a 20th century economy within a framework of new nation building. African education is too often uneasy and indecisive about education in terms of the rediscovered African past, and too often confused by the prestigious aspects of traditional European academic life in its attempt to relate itself more dynamically to developmental economics and nation building. In world terms, a fifth factor in the contemporary education explosion is simply the fact that there are so many more nations now than there were even a few short years ago, and that these nations mean new administrative units in education. I do not mean to suggest this is an unfortunate situation, but only that it is complex and often baffling. Every new country has to have its new Ministry of Education. New ministries of education have to find their distinctive ways of working, have to develop an adequate reservoir of personnel, have to find out what they can do and what they cannot do, have to develop efficiency in a bureaucracy which is too often primarily concerned with other matters. When one considers in global terms the new ministries of education which have come into existence since World War II, he can only be astonished that they have achieved as much as they have. Even so, many of them, and most of them in Africa, are now on what might be described as their shakedown cruises. The very newness of the administrative offices of education in virtually all of tropical Africa is a factor in the education explosion. During the colonial period, the European powers created many of the boundary lines around present-day African nations. Superimposed on a vast tribal distribution and based on pre-aviation, often half knowledge of geography, many of these boundary lines are quite artificial. In many of the new countries, the consciousness of national unity, which is adequate to support a strong national system in so intimate a matter as education, is not present. Under colonial authority, nevertheless, departments of education or ministries of education were created, usually quite centralized in power structure, particularly so in French and Belgian Africa, less so in British Africa. These departments or ministries carried out the educational policies and reflected the educational characters of the metropolitan powers. Designed for such situation, they have nonetheless tended to become the structural models of the new national departments or ministries. If it had been possible to take a completely objective approach to the creation of these new governmental units, free from the colonial past and focused on the role of education in an emerging state, quite new ministerial structures in relation to bureaus, departments, divisions, job descriptions, and functions might have been discerned. No such freedom from the past is ever possible, of course, so in Africa, as elsewhere, a considerable number of national ministries of education were already organizationally somewhat archaic when they were created, and at the same time, they were given tasks of nation building of indescribable complexity. They were expected to become major agents of nationalism, to rediscover and harmonize tribal and communal traditions within a national framework, to provide manpower for economies which were skyrocketing in various directions, and to create new educational institutions and programs which would add to the prestige of the new states. These are not easy tasks, and the model of the ministry to perform them can hardly be found in Europe or in America or in traditional Africa. The ministerial difficulties in much of Africa are much more than structural, organizational. I've recently had the opportunity to visit the offices of a number of these new educational authorities. At the top of the ministries, one ordinarily finds well-educated, professionally minded persons, deeply sensitive to the role of education and deeply loyal to their government's national development. Some of the ablest, hardest working persons I've ever met are permanent secretaries and bureau chiefs in the newly established ministries of education in Africa. But they operate under conditions which would ordinarily drive an American executive to drink or perhaps onto the couch of his psychiatrist. I've yet to find in Africa a ministry of education which is well staffed with administrative assistants and secretaries or has anything like the access to information essential for sensible administrative decisions or policy formulation as has the office of even the lowliest dean or departmental chairman of an American institution such as UCLA. This is not the fault of the African leaders, but it is a limitation, a severe limitation with which they have to cope. The development of an efficiently operating administrative unit takes time, more time than most of the African nations have had, and takes a body of supportive personnel, filing clerks included, not yet ordinarily available in the new African states. Another complication in the development of coordinated national systems of education under ministries which are ordinarily more powerful and centralized than our own is the diversity which has characterized missionary education in Africa. For the century before independence, mission schools were the most characteristic schools of most African states. These missionary educational efforts, coming from Catholics, from Protestant sects, and in its traditional way from Islam, involved a wide variety of assumptions about the relations between church and state and between education and religion. New national constitutions did not eliminate, though they did reduce, the range of these assumptions. The mission schools, together with missionary support and leadership, are for the most part essential to the maintenance of education on a scale commensurate with African plans. The new ministries of education have had to work out delicate plans of state support and state direction for traditionally autonomous missionary schools and colleges. This is not an easy task in Africa or elsewhere, and on the whole, the African states have dealt with the problem reasonably and constructively. The operative conditions, however, make the planning of a fully national educational system in Africa extremely complex. Having to work with missionary installations in one dimension and with tribal or regional groupings in another dimension has vastly complicated the creation of efficient new ministries of education adequate to the responsibilities which are politically assigned to them. Now, thus far this evening, I have pointed out 5 socio-economic political factors arising from basic worldwide trends of current decades, which converge on education and in combination give education of the 1960s its explosive character. These 5 are the geometric increase in population, the revolution in rising expectations, the scientific revolution, which is now in its technological phase, the virtual explosion in the amount and scope of knowledge, and the enormous increase in the number of nation states with new ministries of education in a hurry as agents of planned change. Each of these trends is a general phenomenon operative in all areas of the world, and for each of them there are distinguishing features as they function in the great reaches of Africa. Some of these special features I've noted, and they all add both to the complexity and to the potential for African educational development. I should like to turn now for a few minutes to certain factors in Africa's education explosion which do not arise so much from world trends as from the continent's own situation and aspirations. First of all, I want to emphasize the extent to which Africa has already moved forward educationally in recent decades, and particularly since 1950. The story of educational achievement which has already taken place in tropical Africa is nothing short of amazing. This achievement and the determined drive behind it must be fully recognized in order to see such problems and complexities as exist, and as I have thus far emphasized this evening, in their proper perspective. In 1961, approximately 1/5 of the age group 5 to 19 years in tropical Africa were in school, and the number has increased somewhat since that date. This is no mean achievement, and should not be obscured by the fact that 4/5 are not yet in school. It took the British colonies in North America and the United States a considerable number of decades to reach the point of having 1/5 of its youth in school. Between 1953 and 1957, enrollment in the elementary or primary schools of Africa increased by 63%, and those in secondary schools by 72%. These figures are considerably above the world average. Virtually all the universities of tropical Africa have come into existence or attained university status since the end of World War II. One has to be impressed with the general African conviction that education is the magic to be practiced in making the dreams of personal and national advancement come true. Education is seen by most Africans as the basic tool needed for further development. Since their independence, African nations have consistently spent a higher proportion of their national income on education than have most other nations of the world. The most rapidly growing body of foreign students received in Europe and America since World War II is the group coming from tropical Africa. With efforts and advances in education such as these facts indicate, the further dreams of advancement which animate African education today cannot be dismissed as impossible. The major locus of this educational achievement in Africa, at least in quantitative terms, has been at the elementary school level, and particularly in the earliest years of schooling. The number of children who start to school is extremely impressive, but the number who drop out fairly early is also impressive and disturbing. Elementary education involves, for most pupils, the acquisition of one and sometimes two new languages. It is ordinarily more bookish than Europeans or Americans would find desirable. One of the major opportunities for reform in African schools today lies in the area of the elementary school curriculum. In that curriculum are combined the problems of recultivating the indigenous tradition, opening doorways to a new kind of society, and the acquisition of the basic tools of learning for oneself. Some years ago, most of the African nations became particularly conscious of their shortages in secondary education. The Addis Ababa Report and such national analyses as the Ashby Commission made for Nigeria called attention to the necessity for increasing and improving secondary education, and great advances are being made in this area. There are more high school graduates now than ever before, and the number increases each year. But again, one must ask what high school graduation means in tropical Africa. It means, on one hand, an increased number of pupils ready to go on to the university, and this is an important asset. It means a considerably larger number of persons seeking clerical careers in government service. This can cease being an asset to the general economy, for there are already in many places more clerks than there are clerical jobs, even though no African nation is as unfortunate as India in this respect. High school graduation means for some African students technical and vocational training looking toward careers within the new industrialization. For almost no graduates, however, does it mean preparation for a career in agriculture. Yet agriculture is the basic factor in the economy and is urgently in need of educational upgrading. And for very few girls does high school graduation mean improved ability in homemaking, child rearing, health, nutrition. One can only conclude that, on the average, the secondary education curriculum in tropical Africa is about as much in need of reform as is the elementary curriculum. In terms of American experience, the African secondary schools are too much influenced by present-day high schools and not enough by the American high schools in our own urgent developmental era. There are steps in functionalizing secondary education in terms of national needs and career possibilities which cannot wisely be omitted by nations, no matter how much they are in a hurry. Africa today needs some equivalent of what the United States found in its high schools at the turn of this century, or what Denmark found even more recently in its folk high schools, or what Great Britain and France are seeking in their current expansions of secondary education beyond university preparation and preparation in technology. African higher education has made unusual advances in recent years, both in the humanities and in the scientific fields. One can only be impressed with the beauty, the design, even the luxury of the university plants which now dot the African landscape, some 34 of them in the area we're dealing with, I think. But one must be conscious of that beauty and that growth, and also be worried. Virtually all of these university plants were constructed primarily with outside financial aid, money from Great Britain, or France, or Belgium, or the United States, or through the various agencies of the United Nations. Most of the new plants are not very economical to operate. They have too small an enrollment, now or in immediate prospect, for maximum economy of maintenance and operation. It is, I think, unfortunately true, also inevitable, that there are more universities in this part of Africa than strict objectivity, divorced from regional and national loyalties and prestige drives, could justify. The amount of outside support which can be indefinitely committed to these universities is uncertain, and the nationalism on which they rest, both in East and West Africa, has not yet been fully crystallized. It seems to me almost inevitable that there are some difficult years ahead for a majority of the new universities, but at the same time, the best of them, and the best of the programs of all of them, are essential to African progress. The UNESCO-sponsored conferences of African ministries of education, held in the early 1960s, have identified 3 areas of priority concern in the further development of African education. The first is the expansion and improvement of secondary education, both for the sake of manpower development and to increase the reservoir of university students. The second area of concern is that of curriculum reform at all levels and in terms of developmental needs. I have repeatedly referred this evening to both these matters. Now, in conclusion, I must give brief attention to the third area of concern pointed out by the ministers of education in Africa, that of teacher education. No educational system is likely to be better than the human beings who operate it. An adequate corps of good teachers and good administrators is an absolute requisite for a good educational system. And unhappily, the most persistent and critical educational problem in Africa today is its woeful shortage of adequately educated teachers and administrators. During the colonial period, and particularly through the missionary schools, most of the teachers in Africa were expatriates. While there have been increasing numbers of Africans going into teaching, the supply has never been adequate. As the new governments have been established, many of the best of those trained for teaching have been called into public service. An astonishing number of the leading officers of African states are ex-teachers. There have been and are crash programs in teacher education in all the new nations. But even so, the supply continues to lag farther and farther behind the demand for teachers. Consequently, African education continues to draw heavily upon expatriate teachers, some as missionaries, some as regularly employed public servants, some supplied through the various agencies of foreign aid. In this sense, the Peace Corps is a major boost to African education. It has been extraordinarily successful, and over half, for example, of the secondary school teachers of Ethiopia today are Peace Corps volunteers, many of them trained here at UCLA. But I do not want to talk of teacher needs purely in quantitative terms, serious as those are. There is much to be done in the improvement of the methods and the standards of teacher education in most African institutions. First of all, teacher education there is too much separated from general education. It's a side channel which gives pupils a little learning mixed with an overdose of dull methodology. And the teacher training programs and institutions, single purpose in character, lead most people on to a single career, the underpaid and under-honored job of teaching. This is particularly true at the elementary level, but also at the secondary level. In Nigeria, for example, most secondary school teachers come from special colleges which offer 3 years of work beyond the high school, carefully infused with pedagogy and not leading to a degree. The UCLA School of Education, under an AID contract, is now helping to develop one of these teachers' colleges in the Federal District of Nigeria. And I know from long conversations with its students and faculty how bitterly they feel frustrated by the narrow, single-goal character of this institution, by its separateness from the general flow of higher education. Fortunately, but only this year, we've been able to take steps toward the amalgamation of this teachers' college and the immediately adjoining University of Lagos. But the achievement is, I am sure, a strong step forward in reducing the isolation of teacher education, in bringing the education of teachers back into the mainstream of Nigerian educational development, if I dare use the term mainstream so soon after the election. I will not bore you with the details of curricula in the African programs of teacher education. In general, however, I think there is an overemphasis on rote learning, a rather heavy-handed emphasis on how to give assignments and how to hear recitations. Practice teaching there leaves much to be desired. I feel certain that in the teacher education institutions, the need for curriculum reform is very great. One final point should be made. The advanced educational institutions in tropical Africa think of their educational programs primarily in terms of preparing new teachers for their first jobs. Important and necessary as this is, it may not be the most critical factor in upgrading the schools of Africa or the schools of the United States. There are almost no programs in African colleges and universities for the advanced training of able, experienced teachers. Yet the careful education of experienced people for careers as supervisors, school principals, and directors could give a quality of leadership to the educational enterprise which is of paramount importance and is now, to an unfortunate extent, lacking in Africa. Few school administrators coming up through the ranks in Africa have had adequate education in respect to fiscal operations, supervisory leadership, administrative theory, or personnel management. The in-service education of teachers is at least as important, even in Africa, as their pre-service education. The training of experienced teachers for leadership in enabling schools to play a significant role in developing societies is an important item of almost unbegun business on the agenda of African education. I've this evening attempted to suggest 5 major lines of social and economic development which influence particularly the educational development of Africa, and have illustrated those 5 general trends, at least, in terms of the African situation. I've further pointed out certain types of development in Africa, indigenous in character, a heavy emphasis on elementary education, a rising emphasis on secondary education, a boom in universities, which is, I think, bound to have its rebound, and a great crash program, often inadequately conceived in the field of teacher education. If in these remarks I have tended to point out more problems than anything else, I've done this with full knowledge also of the very great achievements that have been accomplished in Africa, and that the tributes that should be paid to the African leaders in education. What is going on in Africa is an experiment of untold significance, not only for Africa, but for the educational advance of the entire world. Thank you very much.
I wonder if there might be some questions. So,
Wouldn't you say there are some dangers in merely emphasizing the education in urban areas? Aren't we, in a sense, influencing the whole course of economic development by putting most of our resources in the urban areas?
Yes, we are shaping the course of economic development, but I think this is the way the African leaders are wanting that development to go. You cannot have an industrial technical society without urban concentrations. I would immediately add, however, that I define urban not simply as the city, but as the city and its hinterland. When I talked about Onitsha in eastern Nigeria as a great market center, it is a market center for a large area, and it's that large area with a complex network of villages that seem to me almost like a metropolis. In the third place, I think in Africa, as in the United States, our educational planning has not been enough in terms of the metropolitan units. I know the superintendent of schools in Los Angeles has enormous difficulties in developing the kind of program that is desirable here, partly because Sacramento legislature is rural dominated, and partly because there is no single agency in the federal government or within the United States Office of Education which is primarily concerned with helping metropolitan units. It is this that I had in mind in making the comments that I did.
Other question?
In the late 30s, when Cardenas tried to institute a crash program of education in Mexico, there was considerable trouble in the farthest, in the remotest villages when it came to accepting the teachers on a local level. Now, in Africa, I understand that Nigeria is too densely populated to present a problem like this. But does this problem exist anywhere else in Africa, in the remote villages?
It exists in the remote villages in Nigeria as well as elsewhere, and particularly if the teacher is an import, is not of the village. It takes a great deal of sensitivity to human beings for a teacher to go into a village and be an agent of social change. But this is being done. This is the fact that in many villages the teacher is not so well received is one fact that should make us be a little cautious about our American assumptions on the value of local control of educational systems. It is sometimes important for an outside government unit to be able to place a teacher there, even if the villages do not want it. This is particularly true of Turkey, for example.
You mentioned the diversity of missionary schools, and you didn't say
What I meant to bring out was the fact that there has to be a working relationship between the new Ministry of Education and whatever missionary schools exist, because the missionary schools must operate in order to carry out, in order to reach their educational goals. And since the missionary schools have themselves various concepts about the relation of religion and education and about the relation of church and state, this is often a complex matter for the ministries of education. Fortunately, within the constitutions, they have worked out for each state a position which seems viable. I don't think this is one of the critical problems at present, but it is a complicating problem for the operation of a ministry charged with developing a national system. Do I answer your question fairly? Not quite. Let me give another illustration. In Mexico, in the period that was referred to a moment ago and later, there was a quite complete separation of church and state and of religion and education. And yet now there are many privately organized, religiously supported schools, but they must all use the curriculum prescribed by the national ministry and employ teachers certificated by the national ministry. They cannot do otherwise. In most of the states of the United States, we have a different system. The private schools have a right to exist, and they are relatively free from government control. Government control of teacher licensing, of the curriculum, of health conditions in the school, or of the brakes on school buses. Now, we don't know which is, I'm not saying at the moment which is right. I'm only saying to find a viable way of procedure when the private schools, missionary schools, existed in such number as they did in Africa and are so essential for the further educational development as they are. That's a very complicating thing for a new Ministry of Education. Yes?
Two questions that are a little bit involved with each other. We all know how important it is for the family background in helping children in education. I wonder what the general attitude is of the families for the education of their children. That is, the families who have had no education, and also any attempt at adult education so that the adults may be able to help the children in any way.
This is often a very complicating factor. In the boys that are at the secondary school, which we maintain at Port Harcourt, I suppose a majority of them are supported by their families or by their villages, the village being almost an extended family in many respects. This is done by families or villages which are already impressed enough with change to be willing to send their sons away, to divorce them further from the family and the village. But there often comes a point when this divorcement becomes more than the parents want to bear. And at that time, the boy's in trouble and the parents are in trouble and the teacher has a hard time of it. In certain sections of Africa where religious convictions are dominant, the question of what kind of religious school the boy goes to or the girl goes to becomes of paramount importance. And unless the child stays within the framework that the family can approve, then he is in trouble. I think you find this a universal problem accentuated in areas that are relatively remote and backward. Yes?
You touched on this point slightly, but do you feel that there's an air of artificiality about the idea which many African leaders have still maintained in regard to following the educational system in the former mother country? Do you feel that there are certain modifications more applicable to the various indigenous cultures which are coming about? And if so, is this a positive trend rather than
Well, I'll evidence some personal biases in my answer, and you must discount them. And I'll answer in terms of two illustrations. In Nairobi recently, I was taken to speak to the boys of what is probably the best secondary school in that area. We went to a perfectly beautiful plant, and I was ushered as the speaker into a beautifully paneled Tudor-like room, and here were 200 boys, handsome young men, I think intellectually very able from what I would gather, every one of them with the blazer and the old school tie. It was something of a shock to see the extent to which the social tradition of an elite had been carried over into that school. Now, they need an elite for leadership in Kenya, there's no doubt of that. But whether it's going to come from those rather favored boys, I'm not quite sure. The other thing is, in the Port Harcourt School, where we're now operating, the students have recently gone on strike. And the basic reason why they went on strike was because they wanted to take the vocational examinations originally set by the guilds in England and later transferred to the West African certificate group. The boys wanted to take those examinations. They didn't want to study anything that didn't prepare them for the examinations. We were trying to develop a technical and vocational secondary program that we thought gave them something beyond these examinations. But they felt that the examinations and the certificates secured by the examinations were the guarantee of getting a job, and they didn't want anything to do with the rest of it. So therefore, they went on strike against the curriculum. Now, the strike's been settled. Everything's happy right now. But from my point of view, there is too much reliance in the African nations on the European models, and there is sometimes too much reliance on American models. And there are too many Europeans and too many Americans working in Europe, in Africa, trying simply to transfer their own educational backgrounds and institutions into Africa. There has to be developed there an indigenous kind of program, and it will be slow coming. But it has to come, or Africa won't work. Take Nigeria, for example. There are now three major universities in Nigeria. Ibadan, which is a straight European transplant. Enugu, which is a transplant of a Middle Western land-grant university. And the University of Lagos in the capital city. I hope that the University of Lagos is going to be Nigerian rather than British or American, but I don't know. Other questions? Yes, way back here. The lady, yes.
Do you share the concern of some of the others in these countries that are just emerging that there's been too much emphasis on the education of men and the women are still pretty much tribal and village?
Yes, this is particularly true, of course, in the Muslim territories. It is true generally, however, over Africa. Rather remarkable progress is being made in increasing the proportion of girls in school at all levels. I think the new Africans are themselves deeply conscious of this problem, and they're determined to overcome it. I don't think it's one of the critical things we need to worry about, although I wish there were more women in African education than there are.
In a previous lecture, we were told that there were about, on an average of about 5,000 tribes and about 800 various dialects. How does a teacher cope with this?
Well, the teacher doesn't have to deal with all the tribes or all the dialects.
Not 800 at a time, but how do they manage that?
Well, the problem of language is one of the problems most difficult for elementary education all over the world. In some parts of Africa, even more pointedly in some parts of Asia, newly developing Asia, a child starts to school in a vernacular, speaking a vernacular. And maybe the first reading materials will be in that vernacular, which may be a very local thing. He may then have to move to another native language. It may be the national language. In the Philippines, for example, it would be Tagalog, or Filipino as they now want to call it. But this is to him a strange language. In the second year of schooling, he begins to study it as a language. 2 years later, all of his instruction is in that language. And the moment he gets into, I'm now in the Philippines, he gets into Tagalog, he begins studying English, so that when he gets 2 years later, all of his instruction is in English. A child spends just too much of his time learning languages, and the teacher has to do the same thing. The problem of a universal language, or of at least a few of the major languages, is a major one if you look at education in world perspectives. Yes?
I have great interest, but little knowledge, really, of this. You spoke of the Peace Corps and their contribution. Has Crossroads Africa...
Yes. Crossroads Africa has done an extremely good job, has contributed much in many places. I mentioned the Peace Corps simply because it is so very much larger than Crossroads Africa, involves so many more people in Africa as a whole. I think the motivations are exactly the same on the part of the people who are operating in both agencies. Let's have one question from Africa.
Yes, as a participant in Crossroads Africa, I'd like to ask this question. What can be done to regularize, or at least to formalize, systems of education in some of the Muslim or nomadic areas where you're dealing with
Well, you're asking me for an answer that I don't really know. But I am impressed with this. In Nigeria, the Muslim areas to the north were far behind the southern areas in educational development. The eastern and western region were far ahead of the north. But now the north seems to have decided to move ahead. The religious and political leaders have thrown their full weight behind the program. They have found their own method of regularizing an instructional program. And my guess is that unless the East and the West and the Middle East and Nigeria really get on their toes, the North is going to be ahead of them educationally in about 25 years. So that this regularization that you speak of can't be imposed from the outside. It has to be something that grows up inside with full attention to the power structures that exist there.
In depicting the demonstrations by university students, there's always so much violence involved. Now, I'm wondering, are they so deeply engrossed in the political changes that these demonstrations grow out of political idealism?
Are you talking about Africa? Or Berkeley?
No.
Or Latin America? I think students generally over the world have a much greater tendency to participate in politics and to participate with demonstrations and violence than do students in the United States. This is in part true because traditionally the universities are sanctuaries in the same sense that medieval cathedrals were. And the police of the country cannot penetrate the campus without the rector's consent. This gives an opportunity for a good many agitators to become almost permanent students in the university. I'll add immediately that one of the great advantages of American education is that we have a very definite exit as well as a definite entrance from the university, and most other universities don't have that. So you find professional students staying on campus to develop a political following and usually responsible for much of the rioting.
I'm sure I express all our appreciation for a very informative, excellent lecture. Thank you.